Hello and welcome to the Enlightenment podcast. To our listeners and viewers around the world, we very much appreciate you tuning in week after week. We feel at this time it's really important to have a dialogue about Palestine, to give context to what's going on, a context which we believe is not always given by legacy mainstream media, and also to highlight the rich history and culture of Palestine and the indigenous Palestinian people. Today, we have a very special guest with us. I always say that, but they all are special, but this one is super special. We're going to explore truth, advocacy, activism, and resilience of the Palestinian people, the famous Sumud, with Omar Dajani. Omar, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
It's such a pleasure to be with you, truly.
Thank you. Well, let me give you a brief introduction. Omar Dajani is the Carol Olson Professor of International Law at McGeorge School of Law at the University of the Pacific. That was a mouthful, but it's so meaningful. We love it. With family roots in Jaffa, as well as Syria and France, Omar was born and raised in East Texas. A Yale graduate, he served as the legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks with Israel, including participating in the summits at Camp David and at Taba. Subsequently, he worked in the office of the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East process in Jerusalem, peace process. He's also consulted on a variety of legal infrastructure development and conflict resolution processes for institutions, including the US State Department. Currently, Omar is co-chair of the joint board of A Land for All, which is a movement that advocates a two-state confederation within Israel-Palestine. He is published widely in academic journals and in media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post. His recent book, Federalism and Decentralization in the Contemporary Middle East and North Africa, which is from Cambridge University Press and co-edited with Asli Bali, explores institutional design solutions for addressing identity conflict and governance challenges in the MENA region. MENA region. Ugh, there we go. I think it's also being adapted for a Marvel movie. Uh, I I may have made that up, but let's start. I'm going to start with a really left field question. Hanan, how do you know Omar?
Long story, Shamim, but Omar almost became my brother-in-law. And that's through Samir, his older brother, who is still a very dear friend to this day. And Samir was pursuing his master's in chemistry at Baylor University in Texas for our sins. And I was working on my undergraduate there where we met. And I've always had a soft spot for Omar because I affectionately thought of him as Samir's younger brother, baby brother, if you like. And he was always very sensitive and very delicate and very lovely. And his dad was a Palestinian. His mom was Syrian, Allah yarhamha both. A very rich heritage on both sides. And it's clearly influenced his remarkable journey. And Omar also recently, or maybe not so recently, collaborated with my lovely, brilliant cousin, Victor Kattan, on Palestinian issues, which we'll talk about as well. And Omar, it's really wonderful to have you here with us.
It's such a pleasure. And Hanan, I was just thinking about the mess I made of the very first work project that I did for you when I was in high school and you were launching a cosmetics company. And I was remembering I was trying to do a direct mail outreach effort for you. And I can still remember sending out letters with my like fingerprints on them, with the text skewed. And so I've been meaning for years to apologize for the mess I made of your first business venture.
Not at all. I'm glad you remember it. I remembered it, but I wasn't sure if you did because, you were so lovely about it and very, you did it, very efficiently, I think, and really took it seriously as a job.
That's very generous.
There you
Not at
go.
all.
Well, apart from doing mail shots for cosmetics, let's say that Omar, we're going to move the conversation on just a little bit to current events. Um, we like to start with this question because there is a strong Zionist propaganda used to justify the current ethnic cleansing or dispossession of Palestinians, at least, which is the claim that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. Now, your father's family is from Jaffa, I believe, a city renowned for its historic significance and cultural contributions and its iconic oranges. Can you share your perspective on Palestine's ancient heritage and the resilience of its people, your family?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much to say. I'll just maybe start by coming to Jaffa, the town that looms so large in my family's history. You know, just over the last few years, I've been working on a project which will hopefully become a podcast, a narrative podcast about the past, present, and future of Jaffa. And over the course of doing the research for it, one of the things that I've been really trying to understand is our family's history in the place. And so over the course of doing it, I learned about some of the more historical episodes about our great 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 grandfather, Sheikh Salim Dajani, who was part of a delegation that went to plead with Napoleon to spare the lives of the constabulary force in Jaffa when Napoleon vowed, after receiving his ambassador's head in a bucket, that he would take revenge upon them. And then tracing the history of the house that once stood on this, beautiful spot of land overlooking the sea, and finding, records of its construction and of work that was done to it during the Mandate, which, in a way that I never expected, was such an emotional experience for me to see our connection made real through documents in that way, but then also to come to terms not only with the story of my family's forced departure from Jaffa as Zionist militias were shelling the city both from the north and from the south, as rumors were spreading about what would happen to people who stayed because the massacre at Deir Yassin had happened just a few days earlier, and people had heard not only about the killings, but also about mass rapes that had occurred. And so there was a sense of impending doom, and people like my family decided in the space of a few hours to leave this place that had been their home, in our family's case, for centuries, and to sail off, in our case, to uncertainty. And so to learn that story well, and then finally to connect with the people who are living in Jaffa today. I just a few months ago had breakfast with a fellow who's Palestinian, whose family stayed in 1948, who stayed because his father had fled conscription. His grandfather had fled conscription by the Turks earlier, and he vowed that he would never again be a wanderer. So he said, "We will stay planted with our feet deep in the soil, no matter what happens." And that's precisely what they did. And we were having a conversation about resilience, and I was expressing real fear about what's going to happen to Palestinians who are living inside 48, inside the borders of what's now Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and especially the Gaza Strip who are experiencing the sharp edge of Israel's aggression right now. And he said something to me that just really resonated. He said, "Don't worry." He said, "You know, this is a land that has been overrun by empire after empire after empire. And what has survived is us. It's inside of us, this commitment to survival." And he said, "We've got to be sure that we are resilient, that we learn how to grapple with this incredibly difficult deck that is being handed to us." But he said, "But I'm not afraid." And hearing that from him really gave me a, a burst of courage in a way, a sense that, yes, we're part of a larger history, and we have a responsibility as a result of that, but we can also lean on it a bit. So I'm hopeful, even if not optimistic at this particular moment.
No, absolutely. I think words of wisdom and the Sumud in Palestine is very well known well, now it's been going on for centuries, as you said, under occupation and certainly under the Zionist colonization, without a doubt. And actually, one of our favorite places for falafel is in Jaffa. I think Abu Afia, I think, is the name from memory that Shamim and I.
Abu Afia is really good, or Abu Hassan for falafel is even.
Abu Hassan, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Yes, exactly. Where we took the boys and ate
It's
very
amazing.
delicious food. Um, Omar, your dad's family also, like mine, experienced ethnic cleansing from Palestine, leading to life in diaspora. And just can you tell us a bit more about how this history of your father shaped your identity and your commitment to advocating for Palestinian rights and justice and all things Palestinian?
Sure. Um, you know, my, as I alluded to earlier, my father's family fled Jaffa in April of 1948, and they went north in a fishing trawler that my grandfather had a share in to Syria, first Lebanon and then Syria, and then my folks immigrated to the United States, and I was born in the U.S. And although we moved around a bit, including a few attempts to move back to the Middle East, the last one of which I was around for in Beirut just before the Civil War started. But having grown up in Texas, the last thing that I wanted anything to do with was the Arab world, Palestine. I grew up in the 80s, around the time of the Iranian Revolution. Americans' image of Muslims was terrible. Their image of Arabs and Palestinians equally bad. And and so for me, uh, not having grown up in a household like so many Palestinian households where one would hear stories about what life in Palestine was like. My parents were more in the mold of trying to make a life for us in the United States, uh, uh, encourage us to assimilate, to find our own paths there. I really was attached to being an American. And I mean, in the days when I spent time with you, I mean, in being a Texan, moreover, right?
I know, I remember.
And so it was jarring that when I started college in 1987 in the Chicago area, and the first Intifada, first Palestinian uprising broke out, that Palestine broke into the news, and I, at that moment, wrote was what was kind of a smart alecky letter to the editor of the University Daily, because they had, in a way that we have seen so recently in the last year, been publishing news stories that seemed to completely obscure what was happening. And so there was a story about how a number of Palestinians had died in demonstrations in the Gaza Strip in December of 1987. So I wrote like a smart alecky letter saying like, what happened to them? Did they spontaneously combust, or were they murdered? And if so, by whom? And this unleashed a torrent of responses. People wrote furiously back to the paper, accused me of being an anti-Semite, of being a voice of anti-Semitism on our campus. And I got challenged to a debate, one-on-one, no press, by the head of the university's APAC chapter. And so I reached out to a childhood friend of my father's, Ibrahim Abu Lughud, who was on the faculty at Northwestern when I was there. And I said, I don't know anything about this. Could you suggest some things to read? And so he gave me a reading list, and I started to pour through it. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what I didn't know. I couldn't believe the gap between what media in the United States suggests is the dominant narrative and what actually happened, what I was reading in books by reputable historians. And although the debate didn't end up happening because my would-be partner got mononucleosis, thank goodness, maybe for me, I think it sparked a passion that has continued to this day. Maybe an addiction is a better word for it. But it's in the years afterwards, I later came to have a really rich conversation with my father and his family about their experience. And so it kind of completed the circle because the stories I didn't get to hear as a child, I got to hear and even record as an adult, and that was a really a powerful way for me of connecting all of the dots.
And I don't think you should, or anybody should blame their parents, especially Palestinians, because they really went through PTSD. They were ashamed. They were felt helpless in a way, and they just wanted a better future for their children, and especially those who immigrated to the West, like your parents, and especially Texas, from all places, where they wanted you to have the best of life. So, but they kept it all. It was all in there. That kind of the horror they had to go through, which is probably why I didn't talk about it. And we're finding out more and more, a lot of Palestinian friends have gone through that same experience, especially those who immigrated to the West, whether Europe or the States.
Absolutely. And it's incredible, when I was living there, my folks came to visit me in the year 2000, May of 2000. And it was the first time my father had been back in Palestine since 1948, something that they could do as American citizens, but of course only as visitors in my father's own country. And I got sort of excited, and I thought, oh, I'll take them right from the airport to Jaffa. It'll be great. My dad will see his hometown. And I mean, I was just an idiot. I think, I mean, it was so overwhelming. And I was, anyone who has spent time in Jaffa, especially at that point when it was before it became the center of gentrification in the Tel Aviv area, and now a very posh kind of gentrified district. And in those days, it felt like kind of a wasteland because it had been really destroyed. A lot of the urban fabric had been turned to rubble and thrown into the sea, literally. And to take my parents there, and my poor dad, and I kept on saying like, "Oh, do you remember that place? And do you remember that place?" And he just like was inconsolable. And at a certain point, my mom, softly grabbed my hand and said like, "Khali, let him be." And we walked quietly. But for the rest of the time that we were there, until just before they left, he was just a wreck. And I realized how much he'd kept bottled in all those years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tragic with the trauma of everything that's gone on, and it's something that's never addressed because it's so many Palestinians are still fighting for that same freedom, and they're going through the same traumas now. There's never been a moment when you could stop and say, what do we do about the people and what they've been through? But so Omar, you were saying that like in the university, that was the time when you read deeply, and it woke you up to everything that you didn't know at that time. Was it around then that you decided, okay, this is going to be my path for activism and advocacy? Was it more related to, the homecoming with your dad? What was it that sort of drew you on that or made you follow this path?
It's funny. I think uh, it's so hard. I've never been one who very effectively charted paths forward. I'm not much of a planner, as my as my family will tell you, but I think that uh, it was a combination of passion and circumstances. So in as I mentioned, in college, I got involved in activist circles, and it was a time because of the first Intifada when things were really um, there was a lot of attention focused on Palestine, and so I was learning a lot during that time and writing a lot, but then went off and worked in advertising for a couple of years, and then my folks really pushed hard for me to go to law school. Um, uh, my Palestinian grandmother, when she learned that I was going into advertising, which from her perspective was making commercials, she was completely like, "No way, you must go back to." Here was this illiterate woman who was emphatic that I had to go back and get a graduate degree. Um, and so by this point, the Oslo process had started, and at my law school, one of my professors had received a request to help with drafting a basic law for the Palestinian Authority that would include a Bill of Rights, human rights provisions. And so he pulled some students into that, and so I got involved in that process, became really close with another Palestinian student at the law school. And years later, it was 1999, I was working at a big law firm in Washington, D.C. And I didn't hate it. I was a little bored. I'd just been broken up with. And I get a call from my friend Jamal, and he says, listen, Omar, Ehud Barak has just been elected Prime Minister of Israel. I think permanent status negotiations are going to start soon. The UK government, maybe because it feels guilty, it should, for what it's done to us, is going to pay the salaries. Could you take a year leave of absence and come and do this thing because you are a lawyer and like me and know something about Palestine and because we're young enough not to be threatening to the PLO officials who were going to be negotiating. And so I thought, yes, great. But my parents were like, what? So I negotiated with them and negotiated with my firm. And what I thought was going to be a 1 year leave of absence became a 4 year engagement, as you mentioned, initially with the PLO doing this legal advice giving in the negotiations, and then when they collapsed, going to work for the UN. And really, I think since that time, even though have turned to teaching and other things professionally, this sense of passion about and connection to Palestine has maybe become the most important theme in my life and work. And I'm sorry this is such a long story I'm telling, but I tell it in part because I think for those of your listeners who are younger than us and who are thinking about their futures, I think the thing I'd say is that paths wind, and it's perfectly fine to start down one path and go deep, and then take a break and depart and do something else for a while and acquire some skills and then return. And I think that meandering is really sometimes it situates you better to contribute than just going in a straight line.
I agree. If you've read Robert Greene's book, Mastery,
No, I haven't.
I just recommended it to my sons, and the younger one just read it. But it's similarly saying that it looks at a bunch of people, case studies, people who we all consider to be masters in various fields, and how they often had to kind of, as you say, meander their way or try something, find certain things about it they liked, and go to something else. So yeah, no, that's why we like to ask that question. It's always interesting because you almost don't know the answer until you've got that distance of time behind.
And I feel like I'm in the company of fellow meanderers.
Well, I meander far too much for Hanan's taste, I'll say that.
I can't believe it.
Hardly. But so, Omar, so you're happily in Washington at the law firm. You're living your sort of Palestinian identity was being more and more intertwined with your work, and then you find yourself back in Palestine. So can you just kind of reflect on your first visit, your observations, any particular moments that profoundly impacted your perspective whether it's on the injustice or life, or like what did it feel like
Yeah.
for someone, a Texan American, of course, Palestinian who landed in Palestine?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I mean, there are so many things. You know how when you get to a certain age, it's hard for you to like remember what you had dinner for, what you had for dinner the day before. But you can remember like almost minute by minute things that happened during certain formative experiences in your life. And I feel that first 6, 9 months that I was there is one of the most vivid experiences, and it remains one of the most vivid memories that I've got. I mean, I remember I was picked up from the airport and driven back to Ramallah, and I arrived in Palestine for the first time in that fall of 1999, going to take a job working in the negotiations, and so it was a strange thing to come so late to this country that I was somehow helping to represent. I felt intimidated by that responsibility. And you know, we drove up from the airport, which is in between the Tel Aviv Jaffa area and Jerusalem, and what used to, near the city of Lid. And you drive on these roads, and then the thing I remembered so vividly at the start was the settlements. I had written about them, I had demonstrated against them, but when you see them there on the hilltops overlooking these Palestinian communities, and this was before a lot of the security infrastructure that is there today, the massive industrial checkpoints that started to be put into place during and after the Second Intifada. But even without that, sort of seeing that political geography I had seen on maps come to life, seeing the proximity in which these settlements were built around Palestinian communities. I mean, the one that I remember sort of noticing so vividly during those first days was the settlement of Psagot. And literally, if one goes to the town of Ramallah al-Bire, two towns that are right next to each other, um, and just looks up, you've got the higher reaches of al-Bire on the hillsides, and then at the very top, like a garrison looking down, is this line of red tile roofed settlements, and that that feeling that of being hemmed in that way was hard to fathom. But I think that the experiences that were most vivid for me were the ones in my workplace somehow. And I maybe I'll tell you one story.
Oh.
I remember so in December of 1999, we were just beginning these negotiations that were supposed to lead to a permanent status agreement, right? An agreement that was going to end the conflict. And we had been having these endless wrangling conversations about the order in which we would talk about issues. And the Palestinian team had been pressing for a discussion to begin around the legal framework. We said, international law governs relations in this setting. And there are a lot of rules from international law that are relevant to the issues that we are about to take up. And we should have a conversation about what the framework is, about what the content of those rules are, about where we have disagreements about that, before we start getting into a discussion about where the border will be, or what water allocations will be, or things like that. And so after rejecting this for a long time, the Israelis eventually agreed to have a small session, 3-on-3, with uh, a couple of Israeli generals and their legal advisor, and then I was with an Israeli Palestinian politician and a Palestinian military guy on the other side. And I kind of thought, oh, my moment has arrived. Like I here I can make this argument I've been dying to make to them. And so I spend all this time preparing this argument about, you know, the Fourth Geneva Convention and about the UN Charter and about what it means to live in an order based upon the Charter and on international law and blah 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 blah. And so I give this disquisition in front of these people, and as I'm like getting to the position of the International Committee of the Red Cross on the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention, my Israeli interlocutor stops me, interrupts me, and he says, Omar, Omar, sorry to interrupt. Sorry, but with respect, we don't care who thinks the Geneva Convention is applicable.
Wow.
We do not. And unless you want to take it to the Security Council, I think you can stop there.
Oh, wow. Nice one.
So blatant.
Yeah.
And so, like, I think that it was in that moment that my sense of the way in which power operates in that space and the challenge of the presenting law-based arguments in a political process really hit me hard. And also the ways in which, you know, Israel had really not come to terms with the fact that there was peace to be made. I think that they sought an accommodation that would kind of get us off their backs. And I think there was a very different sensibility on both sides.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I just wanted to add about the settlements, as you said, they're truly monstrosities because we used to go from Amman to Bethlehem regularly every year, every other year to see our family there. And year on year, you can see the most beautiful, biblical, wonderful hills being transformed into these gigantic monstrosities with architecture that didn't belong to the land, wasn't part of it, was just ugly and horrible. And it was always on the hills to say, we dominate, we are looking down at you, we can sort of monitor everything. And it's kind of that's almost evil planning, if you like, from architecture to design to where they put these settlements. It was, you felt almost suffocated, and you see it happening, and there's nothing you can do about it. I don't know if you had
Totally.
the same feeling. Yeah.
Oh, totally. I mean, we used to talk about it a lot because there's this tradition of what they call sculptural architecture, which literally imagines a resculpting of the hilltop, not just building on the hilltop. And when you look at Palestinian villages and you see how they are built over time, and there's this kind of relationship between the land and them, and then you see one that looks to transform the land and to, very explicitly possess it. It's hard not to feel that it is built on a feeling of supremacy.
Of course, there's certainly no connection to the land, and there's no feeling for the contours of the land, as you've been saying, because we're talking about a lot of all these settlers are coming from the US, from Europe, first, second generation, and just settling illegally. I just want to keep mentioning, because we talk about settlements, very important to mention to people listening that they are completely illegal. And that leads into something else I wanted to ask you, because my parents and grandparents were born and lived during apartheid in South Africa. And, there are obviously many parallels, and I think even worse stuff going on for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And So, can you just give us a few examples of that? I mean, I know, for example, settlers have their own roads separate to Palestinians, even though it's on Palestinian land. Um, but this concept of Israeli apartheid that's going on seems to be very touchy for people, but it's very clear. It doesn't feel to me like there's much of an argument. So I'd like to your perspective on that for
Yeah,
Palestinians living in
sure.
Israel.
So before I turn to that, I just wanted to say a word about the settlers. And, through the work that I've done lately, I've gotten to meet settlers who are themselves committed to a different kind of life in Israel-Palestine, who feel a deep sense of connection and attachment to the land in the West, what we call Palestine or the West Bank, what they will connect back to the experience of ancient Israelites, but who recognize that the settlements are built upon an idea of Jewish supremacy in that space that is fundamentally wrong. And I think that it's really important for people to understand that for Palestinians, it's not that we are, as Netanyahu cynically puts it, trying to achieve a space that's Judenrein, that's free of Jews. What we're trying to eliminate is a regime that says explicitly in the law, one group of people is superior to another in right, in access and ability to move. What we're looking to do is to integrate, to transform that landscape into something premised upon equality. So I think that there is room in that country for these peoples to live together, but not based upon a regime of supremacy. And I think that that's maybe the place I would start, is that I think that what people don't really understand is that, in this tiny dagger of land on the Eastern Mediterranean, you've got basically the same number of Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, 7 million of each. And of the 7 million Palestinians, 2 million of those are citizens of the state of Israel, but citizens minus, because they are deprived of certain rights. So if they would like to marry a resident of the West Bank, someone from Bethlehem, like Hanan's family, that person could not become a citizen of the state of Israel under Israeli law, and would face constant uncertainty with regard to being a resident of the state of Israel, and being able to pass on to her children the rights that other Israelis enjoy. Palestinians citizens of Israel, cannot live in some communities inside Israel. There are there's this regime that allows the communities to set parameters through which they decide who is allowed to be a part of their communities, some of which, incidentally, are built on the ruins of Palestinian villages inside Israel.
Mhm.
And it's like the Jim Crow South, or truly like all of the United States during the era of segregation and redlining, where literally communities could just say, oh, we only accept Zionists. We only accept someone committed to Zionist values. That's the way it's put. And so Palestinians who are citizens lack this kind of these rights. And then you've got this ladder that goes down. Palestinian Jerusalemites are permanent residents of Jerusalem, but lack citizenship. As a result of that, they don't have an Israeli passport, and they also can see their right to live in the city of their ancestors uh, arbitrarily denied to them from one year to the next if they don't spend a certain number of days in the city, according to what's called the center of life policy. They can see something that very often happens, their homes demolished because they had the audacity to build an in-law unit on the top floor of the building of their family, so that they could accommodate the growth of their family in their own hometown. And then you get outside of Jerusalem to the West Bank. And in the West Bank, as you pointed out a moment ago, Shamim, you've got really two different legal regimes. One for the settlers, where they can move freely, where they can build, expand their homes and communities, engage a planning process that favors them at every juncture, so that if they want to build a new building, there's expedited processing to make that happen. Even though, as you pointed out, their presence there is literally a war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Whereas for Palestinians, those who live in what's called Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, only 3% of their permits for construction will be approved in any given year. And that was before the last few years of a far right-wing government. And if it happens to be the case that a Palestinian and an Israeli Jewish settler end up in a car accident and tempers flare and there's a fist fight, the Palestinian will be tried in a military court, can be detained for up to 48 or 72 hours, depending on the circumstances, without any recourse to counsel, and could be tried in military courts where the conviction rate is in the 90s, whereas the Israeli is tried under Israeli civilian law, a completely different system. The stories go on and on and on, and I haven't even touched the Gaza Strip, but what we see is a system where, as every important human rights organization that has engaged the question, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Israel's premier organization, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, that they've all concluded that there's apartheid there should be an uncontroversial proposition.
Yeah, very much so. And actually, even I think Desmond Tutu said apartheid, Israeli apartheid is much worse than what they went through in South Africa. Omar, you worked with the UN, you consulted for them, and it was established in 1945. And at the time, 50 countries signed the UN Charter, because around 80 former colonies were still under either occupation or they haven't had their independence yet. So when the UN General Assembly passed the decision to partition Palestine in 1947, which I think is illegal, but anyway, we'll talk about that. And they gave 56% of Palestine to the Zionists to create a Jewish state. So only 33 countries or nations, including the US and Canada, voted in favor to partition Palestine. Again, a land that did not belong to them. 33 countries decided the future of Palestine, its indigenous people, without the consent or the approval of the Palestinians or any of the Arab states around it. So can you unpack the significance of this decision and its lasting consequences almost 8 years later, 77 years later, 8 years?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to think about the historical context, which was a period during which an incredibly bad idea was making the rounds, thanks to our friends, the British, which was the idea of partition. This is something that gets implemented in Asia Minor and Greece at incredible and horrific cost to the peoples there. It's something that gets implemented even more horrific ways in the Indian subcontinent when Pakistan and India are separated and some 20 million people are displaced. And if it's not bad enough to have had those two horrific examples with all of the dislocation and horror, to see it implemented yet again, to see the idea of what should one do when you've got in a space where there is a heterogeneous population, and heterogeneous in this case, in Palestine's case, because Britain facilitated the migration of Jewish immigrants to Palestine in waves. And of course, by the time the 1930s arrive, and we're talking about a context where persecution gives way to Holocaust, to genocide in Europe, you can see why there was deep anxiety, but it is striking, of course, and a deep desire to find anywhere for these Jewish refugees to go. But it's striking, of course, that the countries who these days are among Israel's greatest supporters and advocates closed their doors to Jewish refugees at that juncture and instead facilitated their being pushed elsewhere. But yeah, so you have this bad idea that the right way to deal with a heterogeneous space is to draw a line in the middle, and not even in the middle, as you pointed out, Hanan, with some 55% of it going to a population that at that juncture represented around a little bit more than a third of the population present, that owned around 7% of the land. And I think that the decision at that juncture to opt for partition rather than for trying to make democracy work across that space was informed in part by the recognition of what had just happened in Europe, by the sense that there should be a space where Jews were the majority. And so there was some engineering done to try to create that through borders. And tragically, when the partition plan was announced in 1947, what it gave rise to was not an arrangement that would end conflict, but one that would perpetuate it, because what the Zionist movement proceeded to do was begin very deliberately to acquire more territory, including places like Jaffa and Haifa, where there were Palestinian urban populations, but particularly Jaffa, which it was supposed to be part of the Palestinian state, and it encouraged the kind of process of ethnic cleansing that we'd also just seen happen in the Indian subcontinent. And what is tragic is that that moment could have given rise to a very different kind of process, even with all that had happened in Europe and even with all that had happened in Palestine at that juncture. There was still at that moment the possibility of building a reconciliation process built upon democracy and minority rights. And the fact that the world chose at that moment not to do that, unfortunately, tragically, destined us to the predicament that we're in today.
Yeah, Omar, I agree. But I just wanted to also add the 30% Jewish population only increased in the sort of under the British in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Before that, it was a much smaller, tiny little percentage. And it was as you said, the encouragement of Jewish immigration even before the war, due to all kinds of things, including Balfour and including anti-Semitism, including, you name it, the Zionist movement. But at the end of the day, just to remind the audience, Arab Jews lived across the Middle East for centuries, including in Iran and Turkey, protected as people of the book, had rights, were very successful, did extremely well. And there was a very small percentage in Palestine, I believe 3% or so Palestinian Jews. Everyone lived and coexisted. And it was only when the European Zionists started immigrating and forming gangs, Stern Gang, Haganah, etc., and massacring the Palestinians from the 20s to the 30s during the Palestinian revolt onto the 40s. And they were very well trained by the British. They had the latest equipment, latest everything. So they had a plan in place. And it wasn't they just happened to come as these poor immigrants who came to get refuge. They came with a mission and a vision and a plan towards taking over when the time was right.
Yeah, I think that, that's important, a really important part of the story. I would just add, um, first of all, that there's a great book written by a, a scholar whom I really respect and consider a friend, Menachem Klein, who's based in Jerusalem, called Lives in Common. And he tells about the experience of Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in Palestine prior to the Nakba, and it was a story in which lives were very intertwined, in which there was a remarkable degree of intercommunal cooperation, and that it was not a conflictual relationship. And so when people imagine that there's always been ethnic conflict in Israel-Palestine, it's just not true. And as you say, Hanan, I think it's the fact that national conflict gets or nationalist conflict gets brought to Palestine with Zionism that creates this other path that didn't need to occur. Um, yeah, so I think
I know,
I
absolutely. And since you mentioned authors and a friend, we don't know him, but Avi Shleim, Iraqi Israeli historian, who also wrote about the Iraqi Jewish experience and how the Iraqis did not want to move to the newly formed colonial state of Israel. And it took the Mossad and he linked it and could find the evidence of bombings of synagogues in Iraq to push people, encourage them and scare them into immigrating. So they were very happy in Iraq. They were very prosperous. They did well. It was only after the Zionism started their movement that things really got worse and worse. But sorry, yeah, that's my.
totally, yeah, no, it's and Pape is also, yeah, for folks who are listening, if you just go on YouTube, he's got some really great interviews about exactly the
Yeah,
story that Hanan is describing.
Yeah,
that's right.
absolutely. But just because we were talking about the UN, just to go back to that, because I think I get your point, Hanan, which is that what right did the UN and these just 33 countries have, and Omar, your point to just put a stroke of a pen through this land. There's that, which I also, okay, I agree with you, it's completely wrong. But on top of that, we can say that apart from that 56% of land, it grew within a very short space of time to 78% of the land as the settler colonial project just grew and grew and grew.
Sorry, Shireen, didn't grow.
Yeah,
In 48, they took over 78% of the
they took
land.
over. Sorry, you're absolutely right. Where land was stolen, let's say it that way. Let's just
Yeah.
say it as it is. Um, and then in March 1949, as I understand, the UN voted to admit Israel into the United Nations, with 37 countries voting for Israel to join. But I believe that Israel's admission to the UN, and I don't think I knew this previously, was conditional. And the conditions of that were that they would respect international law and they would respect the Palestinian right of return. And those conditions were flagrantly unmet for pretty much from then on. But we look at Israel acting with impunity today and we wonder, well, how do they get away with it? But I think from day one, if that was the condition of them being in the UN, they should really have been kicked out some time ago in terms of crossing international law and not allowing the Palestinians the right of return. Is that how you see it, or?
So there's a lot there. I mean, I think yes, Israel's admission was contingent upon their acceptance of UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which called for just settlement of the refugee problem, including by laying out the right of refugees to return to their homes. And Israel has undermined realization of that right from the word go, and has never really since registered its acceptance. I think it pains me that there is this dynamic continues to this day. You may remember that in September of 2023, Israel was admitted to the US's visa waiver program, according to which Israelis can enter the US in the same way that Brits can, without getting a visa in advance. And and this was done with the idea that um, this would, you know, be conditional upon Israel's compliance with rules about Americans of all ethnicities being able to enter Israel without trouble, and that includes American Palestinians. And sadly, the reality is, from what I have read, many Palestinian Americans have run into a lot of trouble entering Israel since this moment. And it's agonizing to me that there is this kind of enabling of Israel's misbehavior, a willingness to sort of facilitate its participation in all of these international regimes without any willingness to actually enforce conditions. The European Union's association agreement with Israel is another example. And I think that we are at a point now where the question becomes, okay, when a state is engaged in flagrantly illegal behavior of a range of different kinds, from, on the one hand, settlement activity of the kind that we've been talking about, and this is proceeding very, very rapidly, despite the fact that there is literally a global consensus about its illegality. Genocide in the Gaza Strip, ethnic cleansing in the north of the Gaza Strip, and at the very southern tip, bottom of it, and in certain parts of the West Bank. And so the question becomes to Europe and to the United States especially, so through what means do you intend to try to press Israel to comply with the law? What tools are available at your disposal? And what has been, I'm sure, as maddening for you as for me, is to watch spokespersons, whether it's for the Starmer government or it's for the Biden government, endlessly engage in exactly what happened back in 1949. Well, this isn't the moment to push it. We're not going to make an issue at this point. We're in a longer conversation without a recognition that it's never worked. And I think the moment has come to find things that do work, to define conditions, and to do what we do with regard to every other country that is breaking the law. We individually or collectively impose sanctions, and that's a conversation that's long overdue in regard to Israel.
Yeah, it's almost like the UN it's either irrelevant at this point or not viable as a tool for implementing international resolutions, or something in the system needs a massive overhaul, but I'm not sure what those steps are.
You know, it's so I've been thinking about this a lot, Shamim, because you know I think that the problem with the UN is that it turns on the consent of the states parties to it, right? And so, in order to take action, you need the consent of the parties around the table at the Security Council. And um, I don't know what it will take for people to believe again in the UN's mission so that they're willing to suppress short-term self-interest in favor of longer-term collective interest, to say, you know, in order for this security system to work, we've got to do some things that our client states won't like sometimes, because otherwise, you know, the Russians' client states or the Chinese client states will similarly take advantage. And I mean, I just don't know whether we have to wait for a global reset, which I fear means like some catastrophe, or whether more incremental reforms are possible. I have to say, it's a really discouraging moment that way, because I don't see any appetite for serious reform.
No, and as you said, the Security Council, the US has vetoed and used this veto time and again when the whole world has said, stop the genocide, stop this and that. They just They are unwavering with their support to anything to do with the Zionist state of Israel, which is really concerning. And so to go back to or to go to a two-state solution, because again, when everyone's talking about the two-state, and I think you know my views, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But everyone's talking about the 1967 borders, and they keep omitting the additional 22% that they stole in 1948, over and above the 56% that the UN supposedly allocated for the Jewish Zionist state of Israel that Shamim talked about. But why is this earlier displacement of Palestinians is excluded from any talk, and why is it always omission? There's an omission of that fact, and is that legally justifiable? Because as a lawyer, as someone who's been involved in both the UN and the negotiations.
Yeah. So I'm going to do my best not to be terribly long-winded on this front, but I have a ton to say, so forgive me if I'm a little bit long in the telling of it. So I think the first point I wanted to make is that unfortunately international law doesn't constrain that much what can be agreed as a peace settlement. It does place some broad constraints, and one of those is that the core defining rule of the post-United Nations Charter era is the rule that says you're not allowed to take territory by force. And so there is an argument that it is a violation of this rule for a peace agreement to validate an acquisition of territory by force. But unfortunately, and it really pains me as someone committed to the project of international law, I don't think that approach has been vindicated in a lot of places. And so even if we look at places like the Balkans, we see acquisitions of territory by force given a stamp of approval by the international community. And at the end of the day, the world is more interested in peace than it is in justice, and more interested in calm than it is in peace. And so those kinds of calculations, I think, very often determine what states are willing to enforce as far as international norms are concerned. So I don't think that means that we as Palestinians must somehow give up our attachment to the places from which we came, give up our claim to those places. But I think the idea that the international community will offer them to us as part of a legal settlement is out of touch with the way the world usually works, at least in the regime that we live under. So that's the first thing I'd say. Having said that, I do think that the framework that was advanced during the time I was working in the negotiations was really flawed in a core way. It was built on the idea of achieving peace through separation. So the idea was, I think, best captured by the campaign slogan that Ehud Barak used to win the prime ministership in the year 1999, which was us here, them there, peace with Barak. And the idea was, to the kind of self-proclaimed liberals in Tel Aviv, like, you'll have peace, you won't have to worry about these people, they'll be out of sight, they'll be across a border, and we'll have like calm, and that's going to achieve peace. And I think that idea really dominated the process, and it meant that as we tried to find solutions to a lot of problems, there were real difficulties. So when we're determining how to draw a border, for example, the question was, with regard to the settlements, either they would be evacuated and the settlers would be repatriated to Israel, or they would be annexed by Israel, meaning the border would be changed to include them. Um, uh, but in neither case could the settlements remain in place, for example, under Palestinian sovereignty. With regard to Palestinian refugees, like my family, the idea was, hey, if you want to return, you're not going to return to the place that you came from, which is Jaffa. You're going to return to what's going to be your new homeland of Palestine, in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, places that you have a national connection to, but not a deep feeling of connection to in your with your toes in the dirt, right?
So a
And
refugee within your country, basically, part
a
of your
refugee within your
new
country,
country.
precisely. A new
Yeah.
country, precisely. And the list went on. Jerusalem was going to have to be divided, with Jewish settlements called neighborhoods under Israeli rule and Palestinian neighborhoods under Palestinian rule, and some complicated scenario for dividing access to the to places like the Old City. And so I think that that framework of peace as separation is at odds with how both peoples see this place. I mean, like Hanan and I both have necklaces on that have,
Yes.
a map, right? And it's not
Yeah.
a map of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, right? I don't even know how you would make a map. It'd have to be connected in some convoluted way. These two disembodied pieces, um, and and the truth is that also for many Jews who have a connection to the history of ancient Israel, who for them it's not just about modern secular Zionism, but an older link to the story of the Jewish people in that land. That land is not Tel Aviv. It's not the Galilee. It is the places where the kingdoms of ancient Israel and Judah were, which is in the West Bank. That's a long way of saying, first of all, that we've got attachments, both of these peoples, to both parts of this country. And we live on top of each other. I mean, anyone who's spent time there, I think, knows that drawing a line of connection is, I'm sorry, a line of separation is kind of a fantasy. And people who say, oh, it's for security purposes, because, and usually what they mean, of course, is for Israeli security purposes. What they fail to bear in mind is that there are some 2 million Palestinians who live inside what is Israel and who live inside what is Israel in a context where there is the least interethnic conflict of any part of the country. Where people live in imperfect but relative equality, that's where there's been the least trouble. So I think the idea of separation is a really problematic one. But the question becomes, what should be the alternative vision? And this is where maybe Hanan and I have somewhat different ideas.
Sure.
Yeah, let's
I
talk
just
about
want to
that.
maybe articulate your idea first, and
Yeah,
then I'll
yeah,
articulate
sure,
mine.
sure. So
Yeah, go
I'll
ahead.
jump in, but just to add to
Yeah,
something else you just said, and then we'll go to the two states versus one state solution and or alternative. And the Jewish sort of dominance of the region was for 200 or 250 years maximum. So before them, there were the Canaanites, were descendants of, and after them. So we've been
Yes.
there for millennia. They sort of took control. So even to argue that point, which I know a lot of the zealots do, is just so nonsensical because it's just,
It's crazy. And a quick digression on that front. I don't know if you saw there was a piece in the Times of Israel, of all places, just last week, in which it was arguing that, so the researcher had looked at genetic tests of Palestinian Christians. I don't know if you saw this, and
No, I
concluded
didn't.
that the genetic profile of Palestinian Christians overlaps 87% with the profile of the genes taken from sites where the ancient Israelites' genetic material has been derived. And so the point that this person was making is that the Palestinian Christians in particular, Palestinian Muslims, it's a somewhat more complicated story, but there's a lot of overlap there as well. The Palestinian Christians are, to a great extent, the descendants of the ancient Israelites, of the Jews who lived there. And so the notion
I
that
know.
your right is somehow less than theirs, than these folks who migrated in the 20th century, is quite an astonishing.
And let's not forget Jesus was a Palestinian, and the Christians are the original Christians of in the world, the Bethlehemites and the Palestinians. But just to go back to I as you know, Ahmad, I no longer believe in the two-state solution that it could work. And I think the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is acting like the Vichy government in France during World War II, who collaborated with the Nazis. And there's a lot of collaboration between the PA and the settler colony of Israel, because they're just basically doing their work for them. And I know that the so-called peace negotiations, which you just alluded to, were never going to really work. They never wanted a true Palestinian state with its own security and borders and so on. And in my opinion, Israel is an apartheid regime. It's a Zionist, ethno supremacist, settler colonial project of European colonialists who came and took over the indigenous lands of the Palestinians who lived there for millennia. So I see a one state with equal rights from the river to the sea for everyone, with justice, with reparation, with the rights of all Palestinians to return, your family, my family, everyone out there. And that's recognized under international law. But you have your own unique perspective, which is slightly different than mine, because as Shamim said at the beginning, you co-chair the board of A Land for All. I think Richard Branson is on the board or is a supporter of it.
He's a supporter, sure, yeah.
Supporter of a two-state confederation with Israel. Can you explain how can that work and what is, for people who...
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the vision, which I really support, and which folks who want to look up A Land for All, you can find the website, or type in my name. There's a piece in Foreign Affairs from just this last September, in which we lay out in a lot of detail what the vision is. But so the buzz line is two states, one homeland. And we begin, first of all, with the idea that Israel-Palestine is one space. And for all of the reasons that we were just discussing earlier, and that there should be freedom of movement and residence for all Palestinians and all Israelis across that entire space. And so A Land for All stands for the proposition that Palestinian refugees, like my family, should be able to live in the city of Jaffa, as citizens of the state of Palestine and permanent residents of the state of Israel. That Israeli settlers who wish to live in the West Bank and Hebron, for example, which is sacred to Jews as it is to Muslims and Christians, all part of the Abrahamic story, right? Can do that, but not as settlers, but instead as permanent residents of the state of Palestine, citizens of the state of Israel, in a regime that in some respects would look a lot like the one that we have in the Schengen area in Europe, where a French person can live in Greece as a resident, can vote in local elections in Greece, can vote for city council, but votes in national elections in France. And so in one respect, it's a little bit like the framework that you're describing. You actually have the possibility of returning and of moving freely across this tiny place without walls scarring the land and separating us from one another. How is it different? It's different in that at the end of the day, there would be two states. There would be a defined border between the two. That border would be the 1967 line, perhaps with some revisions made to it. That 1967 line would be consequential in one way because it would be the border of the state of Palestine, but not in another, because unlike the old framework, I would be able to go and spend time in Jaffa, which was supposed to be part of the Palestinian state under the partition plan. I could live there. I could make my home there. Um, and so again, that idea of freedom of movement is there. But this gives us this framework of two states within one homeland gives us two things. The first thing that it gives us is for us as Palestinians is the possibility of self-determination. And I don't think that we should underestimate the importance of self-determination. If you look at the struggle of any minority group worldwide, and even in some places, majorities, because we would be just barely the majority in this land, just like the Malays are in Malaysia, there is a recognition that very often self-determination requires dealing with structures of power that have accumulated over time. And to me, I see, just as you do, an apartheid regime on the ground. I see incredible global support for that apartheid regime, even as it commits genocide against the Palestinian people. And I don't want our fate to be forever in the hands of another people. I want the ability to define an independent foreign policy, to define independently an educational curriculum for our children that tells our story in our language, and doing that without having to check and get approval at every turn. So that's part of the story is, to me, self-determination for Palestinians is not only achieved through a state of our own, but to a great extent, a state of our own can help, especially in a world where statehood defines privileges for so many. But the other piece is that I also recognize that there are 7 million Jewish Israelis in that country, in our country, and they're not going anywhere. People imagine that they are more attached to the places in Europe or in the Arab world from which they came. But I know enough Israelis to know better. And many of them can imagine nothing worse than going back to places where the last experience was genocide back in the 40s, or finding their way back to an Arab world in an immediate wake of the conflict that we've had. And so for them, this place is home. And for them, they also seek a measure of self-determination. And while I think we have a lot to do to figure out, and this is the last thing I'll say, a lot to do to figure out how you reconcile these two demands for self-determination in a place that was created as a consequence of a settler colonial enterprise, right? Where there was terrible injustice visited upon Palestinians. How you remedy that while also ensuring that this people, who has suffered extraordinarily as well through history, feels a sense of security and feels that the thing that they regard as being the source of their suffering, always being a minority everywhere, is not going to continue to be. And so what we try is to create a framework that allows for both things to be true, treating the land as one land, but also facilitating self-determination for two peoples within it. And I lied. I'll say one very last thing about it, which is that I think we also recognize that all of these kinds of arrangements can be way stations toward other arrangements. To me, I would love to see down the line a scenario where ethnic attachment or religious attachment gave way to an idea of civic citizenship, to a different idea of what it means to be a citizen of that place, that's not defined by ethnicity or by religion. But we're not there yet. Neither they nor we are in a post-national place, and our necklaces are proof of that. And I think, and so I think we've got to make an accommodation with where people are emotionally today, and create a framework that can offer a space for us to grow in until we're ready to maybe occupy this space together in a different way.
And that sounds a very interesting perspective, Omar. But for me, that means us having to accept 22% of historic Palestine at best, which I don't think, well, I definitely would not be happy with, and I don't know any Palestinian who would. So that's shrinking us from, and even the 67 borders, again, what we talked about earlier, the 67 borders, they took much more land, 22% more than they were allocated for me illegally. So we are shrunk into this teeny little enclave with many little pockets. And as you said, Jaffa was supposed to be part of what was given to Palestine, but is not, is under Israel. And yes, the Jewish people have been treated badly, but it's not our fault. Why should we pay for the price? We have been very welcoming of Jewish people in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, in Turkey, in Iran today. There are 5 seats in parliament, and one is always for a Jewish, Iranian, Christian, Armenian, Zoroastrian, and so on. So the Jewish people have never had an issue. They did when Israel was formed and Zionism started and the massacres and so on. But before that, they haven't. So why are we paying for the sins of racist European colonial powers, anti-Semitic people, to give them our land? They're very welcome to live there as under Palestine, absolutely, because they're not going to go anywhere, as you said. But they can't be the occupiers. They can't be the racist colonial settlers that they are. They can't be the people who dictate the rules and regulations. They come with a very genocidal philosophy and ideology. And it's not about knowing a few Israelis here and there who don't believe in it. I think the actual philosophy and ideology of Zionism is rotten at its core. And I think there's no place for it in the 21st century, for this Jewish supremacy or any supremacy. If they weren't Jewish, if they were Buddhist, if they were, I don't know, any other Hindu, I would say the same thing, because there's no place for supremacy and settler colonialism in this century. We've seen the Americans do it to the indigenous people and tribes, and the same in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This is happening in real life history. We see the genocide happening in real time. These are not people who you can sit and reason with. And it's not because it's Netanyahu and his extremists. It's the ideology at its core. Under every Israeli prime minister, you've had an increase in settlements while they're negotiating peace, so-called peace with us, and signing peace treaties. They continue their expansion. We see what they're doing in Syria, what they're doing in Lebanon. They're next trying for Iran, to have the Americans attack Iran, and Yemen, and so on. They are just running the area. They're expansionists. They want to arrest Israel. They want, what they call Judea, Samaria. So for me, I do not see this really happening. And I know what you said, the West is going along. We need to have divestment. We need to have sanctions and so on. But let's not forget, in South Africa, till the very, very end, the Americans and the British continued to want to support the South African apartheid regime. And it's only at the very end that they finally had to accept Mandela and the new South Africa by force, because the whole world, there was a global movement. There was support for the ANC and to stop apartheid South Africa, if you like. So for me, it's just kind of saying, okay, well, it's not working. Let's roll over and accept our lot in life. That's where I have a hard time with what you said. And I know it's idealistic and it's a different and refreshing view of what could be, but I just cannot see how it could happen. And I think it's just giving up too much as Palestinians. But again, feel free to argue otherwise.
So maybe
I still love you regardless, Omar.
Well, and right back at you. So I know we don't have too much time, but I will maybe just make a few points on this front.
Please do.
So the first thing is that my sense, especially as a Palestinian in diaspora, living a an incredibly privileged life compared especially to our fellow Palestinians in places like Gaza, but really across our country. I feel a responsibility to articulate a vision for the future that I think has some chance of being implemented. And I think that the chance of being implemented is a function in part of what is the minimum that I think Israelis can countenance, can come to terms with. And as I said earlier, I have had a lot of conversations with Israelis and with Jews from many other parts of the world, particularly in North America, but not only. And I think that there are a lot of different visions of what Zionism is about. And some of those I just reject completely, right? A vision premised on supremacy, on the idea that there is some superior claim, either because of ancient connection or because of some balancing of suffering. I just reject supremacy as the basis for a claim. But I also think that there is a very, very, very strong feeling among a lot of Jews all around the world that there needs to be some place that they can turn to. And I think most of them would say, most of the ones I know would say, we would like that place to be liberal. We would like that place to be committed to the right kinds of values, but it needs to be there. And so what I am interested in is finding an arrangement that allows them to have that kind of place while also allowing us to achieve what we need to achieve, and recognizing again that, to my mind, we have an ethical obligation to advocate for things that are feasible. It can feel so good to demand perfect justice. It can feel so good. And the thing is, though, like as a lawyer, I know that if I am speaking to a client whose case I know is really, really fair and just, that I've got to tell that client, knowing the court as it is, knowing the law as it is, knowing how much money we have at our disposal to actually carry this forward versus knowing what our opponents have at their disposal. My advice to you needs to take all of this into consideration, because otherwise I would be committing an ethical breach. I would be failing to represent you properly. And so I get the fury that people feel, especially right now. This sense of like, fuck you, forgive me for saying it, like of just this overwhelming feeling of rage at the injustice of it all. At the end of the day, though, we've got to find a way forward that they will say yes to, because I look at what the world is willing to do, and I see it's pretty limited. The world wasn't even willing to oust the Assad regime. The Assad regime, without the web of support that a state like Israel enjoys, itself pursuing minoritarian interests, subverting democracy for half a century. And even that the world is not willing to subvert. And so I think that we've got to be very careful as Palestinians about identifying an approach that can work. And one can say that the one I'm advocating is idealistic, and it is in a lot of ways idealistic. I recognize it, but I will say that it's one that that has behind it a movement of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews, that 3 days after October 7th, 2023, we had our first board meeting, and it could have gone so wrong. It could have been riven with, anger and acrimony. And this was after not only what Hamas did on October 7th, but also what Israel did in the couple of days immediately following it in Gaza, right? But instead, because I think it was built on the right values, on a sense that both of us have a stake in a better future, that we've stayed together. And I don't think that's a small thing.
No, absolutely, it's a big thing, but it feels to me it's negotiating from weakness, and I never like to negotiate from weakness. I feel for me, it's a bit of a defeatist attitude to say, well, this is how the world is, and let's take our crummy 22% of historic Palestine and live with it and make it work. That's my view. And I also think, yes, you talk about Jewish people. I think they're detrimental, including Israeli Jews who have been outspoken against Zionism. And I think we see it more and more, especially in the US, where young Jewish Americans and Europeans have, for the first time, as a result of what happened last year in Gaza and what's still happening, they're saying, actually, Zionism is anti-Semitic. It doesn't resonate with my values as a Jewish person, as my religion, and so on. And it's a political ideology that has nothing to do with me, and we want nothing to do with it. And you're seeing it more and more as the veil, as the mask has dropped. So yes, you have the zealous who are, no matter what this is, we want more and more land, but you have the younger and the more progressive, if you like, or even Israelis like Ilan Pappé mentioned, and others who are saying, this is unacceptable, this has to stop, and this is wrong. So you have both sides, and maybe you are mixing with certain Israelis who are looking for that solution and so on. But I feel it's not theirs to give or to give us. It's ours, and it's for us to say, we'll include you under our sort of graciousness as we did in the past. And I know they have the superiority right now, and I know they have the US empire behind them, but empires go up and down and things change, and we can see the crumbling of the European countries, and the American empire is slowly and surely crumbling. Maybe we don't see it in this lifetime.
Yeah.
No, it is. And we
Right.
don't see it in this lifetime. It's incremental, but it's happening because injustice, once it's revealed to the world and to people, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take work. It's going to take, so as you said, individual and collective movements, BDS, sanctions, governments like South Africa going to the ICC, ICJ, et cetera, all these rulings. It doesn't matter if they're implementing them or not. The fact is it's happening. It's like the world is shifting, the psyche is shifting, and eventually it'll lead to something. What that something is and when, I don't have a crystal ball, but I just feel like you in diaspora as a Palestinian, I feel we owe it to the Palestinians who are living, like my cousins, under occupation in Bethlehem, in Gaza, their aunties, all over the West Bank and in 48. We owe it to them. If they are resisting and they have sumud and they are willing to put up with the occupation, and they're like saying, no matter what, this is our country, our land, we want justice. Who are we? Because I had that conversation with a cousin from Bethlehem, and she told me, Hanan, you can sit and talk this and this and this. We are living under occupation. We have to go through checkpoints. We are the ones being discriminated and treated like slaves. And so, yes, your solutions are great from a Western perspective. You live in the West, and said, we are putting up with that, and we are willing to continue to resist and to ask for our country, our homeland back. So who are we to come and tell them, no, this is accept your 22% better than nothing? That's where I have an issue with it, Omar. But maybe you're right, and maybe that's what will happen. But I don't know what, Shamim, if you have anything to say, because
I do actually. Just a quick one, not that it's really my field at all compared to the two of you, but I see both sides. I see totally what you're saying, Hanan. Of course, I'm a dreamer and imagination person, and Omar, I was interested in your ethical feeling that you have to put forward a solution that at least has some kind of possibility. So I totally get that as well. Where I come at this is if you have a state that remains as a state of Israel, Israel is it's based on a supremacy. It's based on a world, it's right now in the Knesset, there are nation state laws. It is based on a world where Jews are supreme to everybody else. So just by Israel's nature currently, as it currently stands, it doesn't seem at all practical to me that you can have it living side by side with the Palestine. It just doesn't work, which is why it's not working right now. So it would need Israel in a way to change its entire nature and how it began with really aggressive Zionism. I don't know of many other kinds of Zionism in order for that to work, I think. So for me, that's the biggest issue because Palestine was not predicated on being a Muslim country. People associate it now with Muslim-led for whatever reasons, and because there's a majority, but Christians, Jews, Muslims, everybody lived, as we talked about earlier, in Palestine under, I think that's not really part of the nature of the state of Israel, although they have 2 million Palestinians living there. They had to. They couldn't come from a Holocaust and kill 2 million people. Plus, they needed the labor. They needed the help. They needed so many things. So it suited them. But the nature of the founding of Israel makes me wonder how it could possibly go forward side by side. So for me, that's where I think of, okay, we have this one state. Maybe it's going to be too touch pointy to call it Palestine again, or to call it Israel, whatever you want to call it. But it should be one state where everybody has equal rights, equal citizenship, equal freedom to live where you live. I think yours is more practical and you get more people at the table as at this point in time. And that I can see. So
We should give Omar the last words
yes, please.
before we wrap.
Well, I hope that it won't be the last word because I look forward to continuing the conversation, hopefully in person. The only thing I'd say is that I think each one of these paths is really hard, and each one of them requires transformation of Israel and Israelis. Whether it's one state, which requires complete transformation and requires a transformation of our bargaining position. I don't like to bargain from weakness either, but I think worse than bargaining from weakness is thinking that one has more strength coming to the negotiating table than one does. And I think that again and again has wound us up, caused us real trouble as Palestinians, and we need to come to terms with that and find something that's based on values that we believe in, but where we also can build real alliances with Israeli Jews who are kindred spirits, few as they are these days. But all of these scenarios would be great. And to me, the key thing for us to do is to work together for Palestinian freedom, recognizing that there are a lot of different paths to it, and that a lot of the things that we do will support any of these paths. And so if there's any important thing for us at this juncture, it's building connection among ourselves as a global community. And I mean, I wouldn't exist if it weren't for the Nakba. My parents met only because my father wound up in Syria. And I like somehow the idea that being scattered to the wind has also made us stronger, has also allowed us to come from all sorts of different places and take advantage of what education and experience and life and love in these different places allows us, and to bring that to bear as we try to help our people in the different places where they live. And that, I think, was a source of strength for the Jewish people, and I think it will be a source of strength for us.
Right.
Inshallah.
Well, that is a beautiful note to end on. I think, as you say, where everybody's working towards the same goal, however it gets there, may it happen, and where everybody can live together in peace. Omar, thank you so much. I mean, I think we loved every minute of this, and it was really wonderful to hear how eloquently and imaginatively you talk about these aspects of Palestine today.
Thank you for listening to me go on and on. I really appreciate it.
It was our pleasure. Well, if we as we wrap up, I just want to say please join us again for our next episode. Please look back at previous episodes, and if you enjoyed them, please hit the subscribe button, like them, share them. It all helps us in our goal, which is to just share our point of humanism, to get past this nationalism and fighting between everybody, and just to say we are all actually should be sharing common values at the end of the day. So thank you again to Omar Dajani for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Omar, also thank you. And I know we have a slightly different outlook for the future of Palestine, but we have the love of Palestine, which we share. So Palestine needs more people like you to speak out and to advocate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmad. And as always, we believe that stories and representation matters. Stay informed, stay engaged, take action, and in solidarity, see you the next time. Thank you. Thanks, Ahmad.
Thank you.